Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we are unpacking a deeply provocative text that maps out a really radical humanist roadmap for the 22nd century. And look, this isn't just about making minor tweaks to how we live today. We are talking about a fundamental, ground-up overhaul of our entire society, our global economics, and honestly our entire mindset. So let me hit you right out of the gate with a massive question. Can we actually truly end war in the 22nd century? Our source material argues that yes, we absolutely can. But, and this is a really big but here, it is never going to happen through military deterrence or signing more peace treaties. It literally requires us to completely flip our perspective on human interdependence. We have to wake up and realize that a single human life is the result of a vast collective effort. So destroying it in a war, that's just destroying our own shared investment. To really wrap our heads around this, we're going to hit four main pillars today. 1. Treating war like a pandemic. 2. Redefining power. 3. Finding the true end of poverty. And 4. Unpacking the science of giving.
All right, pillar number 1, treating war like a pandemic.
The author fundamentally challenges our old-school, primitive tit-for-tat morality. Traditionally, when we face injustice, we usually react in one of two ways, right? We either passively submit, which, let's face it, just invites more abuse, or we violently retaliate. But the author points out a huge flaw here. Retaliation just leaves the winning side constantly paranoid about revenge and the losing side burning with hatred. Neither of these paths actually breaks the cycle. It just keeps the wheel spinning.
Instead, the source throws us a third, humanist path, peaceful resistance. And to be clear, this is not about being passive or weak, not at all. It requires immense moral clarity, rather than just having a bigger military. It means having the guts to stand firm and clearly expose the injustice of an aggressor, but without letting yourself become infected by hatred. That's the key. It prevents things from escalating and actually keeps the door cracked open for reconciliation.
Think about how the global community handled the COVID-19 pandemic. We didn't try to bomb the virus, right? We studied it, we endured it, we developed vaccines, we viewed it as a tragedy of nature. But how do we handle human violence? Usually with vengeance and retaliation. We tend to see it as this inherent evil permanently baked into specific people. Well, the text suggests that violent acts are actually symptoms of a psychological disease, a disease that has literally plagued humanity for thousands of years.
Now, this brings us to a highly radical argument from the source. The author argues that terrorism should be treated as a mutated psychological pandemic. The text suggests that the U.S. retaliatory response to 9/11, launching a 20-year war, was tragically counterproductive because it essentially created more trauma and just allowed the disease to mutate further. The humanist perspective argues for justice and preventative measures, absolutely, but stripped entirely of revenge. It's about treating the perpetrator as infected rather than inherently evil. So how do we actually operationalize this in the real world? The author lays out 4 rules to stop any war. First, recognize our interconnectedness. Second, respect human dignity across the board. Third, respond to injustice with truth rather than violence. And fourth, embrace progress with strict moral clarity. Now, the author isn't calling for some naive, overnight utopian disarmament. It's pitched as a strategic ethic, something meant to be adopted over time, maybe even taught to soldiers as a core philosophy of restraint.
Moving on to pillar 2, redefining power and leadership. For centuries, power has been the ultimate prize, which almost always leads to corruption. But the source redefines it completely. Power isn't some divine gift. It's not an inherent right. It's actually a collective fiction. We all just collectively agree that certain individuals have it. It's simply a functional tool, meant to maintain social stability. The text argues that power has to transform from a weapon used for domination into a tool for public service. Leaders shouldn't be idolized. They should be evaluated purely on their actual contribution to the human ecosystem, just like you'd evaluate a doctor or a farmer.
To actually pull off this kind of leadership, the source introduces a 10% tipping point. The text argues that if just 10% of a population becomes what the author terms an Aryan minority, and they are using this specific word to denote a highly awakened, uncorrupted group totally free from the virus of corruption, they can trigger a massive national transformation. This moral minority's integrity essentially becomes contagious, uplifting the entire society over time. And the result of hitting that 10% tipping point? You create the next global superpower. But this new superpower doesn't rely on fear or military conquest or bullying other nations with sanctions. Instead, it outcompetes its rivals through social harmony, massive productivity, and totally principled leadership. It turns into an economic juggernaut simply because its citizens are working for the betterment of humanity. That naturally outperforms any society that's just driven by personal greed.
Okay, let's pivot to Pillar 3, the true end of poverty. Right now, the United Nations metric for extreme poverty is $2.15 a day. But the author questions this entire framework. If you cross that threshold and make, say, $3 a day, are you truly free from poverty? The text argues absolutely not. Eliminating poverty isn't just about scraping slightly above some arbitrary survival line. Because honestly, escaping $3 a day poverty still leaves you completely vulnerable to a single economic shock. You're still just working to survive. The author's new definition of ending poverty is true financial independence. This means building up enough self-sustaining capital, whether that's fixed deposits, mutual funds, stocks, whatever, so that the returns alone cover your basic living costs. In this model, that existential crushing fear of losing your livelihood, it's completely eliminated. To make this happen, the author presents a super provocative policy solution, mandating a 50% savings rate on all monthly income. Now, I know that sounds literally impossible for most people right now, but the source argues that poverty is essentially a philosophical issue, a lack of clarity in how we manage our lives. By culturally or even legally enforcing massive savings, people are forced to cut out unwise consumption and live way more mindfully. Think about the systemic ripple effect of that mindset shift. A 50% savings rate drastically kills off frivolous consumption. And that money doesn't just vanish. It creates an unprecedented wave of capital flowing right into financial institutions. That, in turn, drives an absolute economic miracle of GDP growth. Ultimately, society reaches a point where basic needs are universally met by the returns on that capital. The result? Humans finally work for purpose, passion, and contribution, instead of just trying to survive the week.
Which brings us to our fourth and final pillar, the science of giving.
The author takes a pretty hard swing at traditional, ego-driven charity. Often, what we see is aid as power, where a government or a corporation's philanthropy is actually just a subtle way to assert geopolitical control. It creates dependency. The humanist goal here is aid as empowerment. This totally shifts the dynamic from pity to actual partnership. The ultimate goal is to foster genuine self-reliance while totally preserving the dignity of the person receiving help. There's this great quote from the late Steve Jobs that fits perfectly here. He noted that without a measurement system, you can't actually learn from failure. The source argues that for thousands of years, giving has been entirely intuitive. It's emotionally driven. People give to a cause so they can feel good, without ever really tracking the long-term systemic consequences. And sometimes that can inadvertently reinforce dependency and seriously mess up local markets. So what's the fix? The text calls it the science of giving. This means applying rigorous, hardcore scrutiny to donations, exactly like a venture capitalist would evaluate an investment. It means focusing intensely on sustainable funds and prioritizing real work opportunities over temporary handouts, because work is what restores dignity. And the most fascinating takeaway here? The ultimate goal of true charity is to structure society so fairly that charity itself becomes completely unnecessary. All right, bringing it all together, a reawakened humanity. So what does this 22nd century society actually look like when you put all these pieces together? The author calls it the reawakening century. Now, the text is super clear about this. This transformation is not going to happen overnight. It might take hundreds of years to build up our moral immune system against the viruses of greed, hatred, and corruption. It requires this slow but very steady dismantling of our outdated paradigms, replacing a mindset of survival and conquest with a genuine ethical renaissance. I want to leave you all with a really provocative thought to chew on today. In a world that's slowly moving toward this massive paradigm shift, ask yourself, are you contributing or are you just consuming? Will this 22nd century awakening actually begin with you? Because understanding this material isn't just about predicting some far-off future, it's about changing how we view our daily interactions right here, right now. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this incredible roadmap, and as always, keep learning.